name is Meg Glick, and I'm a social worker at the Child Mind Institute. We are a national nonprofit that supports children and families with gold standard mental health care, advice, and resources, all online and accessible to everyone. You can learn more about the resources that we have available for families during the coronavirus crisis, including telehealth evaluations and treatment, by visiting childmind.org/coronavirus. Today, I will be talking through a tantrum survival guide for all of you who are tuning in. I'm also happy to answer questions on other topics related to managing behaviors and parenting during this coronavirus crisis. So feel free to drop those questions in live as well. Post your questions on the feed. We'll also be including some links to resources that are related to the topics that we're discussing today, including some of the articles that address managing tantrums as well. Also, you can find on our website details about upcoming Facebook Live topics. And remember that we're here every day at 10 a.m. and 4:30 p.m. and look through your questions daily. All right, so going to go ahead and get started talking a bit about tantrums and how to manage those. We know that tantrums are a part of typical development and childhood, and they are also most likely increasing at the moment for many of you because of the conditions that we're finding ourselves in. So we know that anxiety can contribute to increased tantruming for kids, disruptions in routine can contribute to increased tantruming for kids, and any difficulties with divided attention. So we know that many of you, many parents out there are currently working simultaneously while they're meant to be going through schoolwork with their kids at home, which naturally means that you're going to be experiencing a lot of divided attention, meaning that your child is engaging in maybe some work while you are also engaging in work, not necessarily always able to be tuning in with what they're doing at every point of time. So we expect that some increased tantrums are happening for you guys, and wanted to really run through some tips that we give parents on a day-to-day basis at the Child Mind Institute about how to manage those behaviors when they're happening. So I will also be calling out some questions that we've gotten before, some things that are connected to this. And of course, if you have questions that you want to drop in live, I'll be checking for those as well. So we'll start off with tip number 1 for managing tantrums, your tantrum survival guide, is to think about labeling and validating the feeling that your child is experiencing. You may not know what the feeling is, but do your best to try to identify and label the feeling that you believe your child is trying to express with the tantrum. So meaning that if your child is starting to get upset, they're starting to cry or starting to whine, labeling, I see you're feeling frustrated, right? Or I know that this is really disappointing. Trying to give those feeling words to what they are expressing is a really helpful place to start to actually try to prevent the tantrum from escalating. This might not be something that's so helpful if your child is already at the tip of that tantrum, right? The behavior is already escalated and they're experiencing a lot of significant behavioral sort of manifestations of the tantrum. They're on the ground, they're screaming, they're crying. However, if you can try to catch the early signs of the tantrum beginning, that's where you can maybe label the feeling and keep that tantrum from escalating. What we want to avoid, or sort of a don't on this list, is avoid trying to tell your child how they should be feeling, or avoid trying to tell them not to feel the feeling. So things like saying, don't get so upset, right? Or I don't understand why this is so frustrating. Those things can invalidate the feeling. And what we know as adults as well is when someone tells us, right, when has it ever worked when someone's told you not to get upset? Usually, I know for me, that just makes me even more frustrated or angry. So same is true for kids. If we jump in and we say, don't get upset or don't feel that way, it usually just means we're going to see the tantrum escalate even further. So try to label the feeling. If you're going to give any sort of directive, try to focus the directive on actually the behavior that you might want to see instead. So what to do rather than what not to do. So for example, if you see your child starting to feel frustrated because they have knocked down a structure that they've been really working hard on with blocks, right? Or a sibling has knocked it down. You see that this is sort of a trigger for a big emotion, and you can predict, oh, this is a spot where I know my child gets really frustrated and this might be the beginning of a tantrum. This is a spot where you want to think about labeling and describing a behavior that you'd want to see instead. So I see that you're feeling frustrated. if you bring the blocks over to me, I can help you rebuild it. So think about using those if-then statements guiding the behavior rather than don't get upset, it's not a big deal. Instead, I see you're getting frustrated. If you bring me the blocks, I can help you rebuild it. So that's tip number one. Really relates to, we had actually gotten a question previously where a parent was saying how validly they are feeling very irritated by the silly little things that are causing some of these tantrums, right? So things like a block tower falling over might seem really silly to us. Maybe our instinct to say, don't get upset, but really in those moments, think about the fact that for your child, this is a really big deal, even if it seems silly to you. And so taking that moment to really validate the feeling and give them some behaviors to go to instead of tantruming. All right, so I just got one of these live questions. Let me take a look. All right, so this is more of a basic behavior question. So how do I get my son to focus on something other than Xbox? We do go on a family walk. Any suggestions? Awesome question. I welcome you guys to send, like I said before, some of these questions about other behaviors separate from the tantrums. So this is a really good one. I know that for many kids, right, we're thinking about that screen time rules have been relaxed a bit during this time because your kids just don't have as much to do. And these might be ways that they're filling that their time, or maybe ways that they're connecting with other people. But certainly we want to think about structuring other opportunities for them to get engaged with something other than the screens. So it sounds like family walk is fantastic. If there's also ways that your child can be engaged in the screen time, but while connecting to others. So Xbox tends to be a little bit more solitary, but thinking about FaceTime sessions with other friends, right? FaceTimes with family members, depending on the age of your child, thinking about setting up play dates where your child can engage in games over the screen. Those are great options. As a family, folks are thinking about game nights, board games, those kinds of activities, engaging in any indoor types of exercise too. So if you can't get outside for a walk, I know we've shared some resources here and also on our website around some free apps that you can find that do movement activities, yoga activities. All of these are great things to try to build into this schedule. And just really think about trying to set up ahead of time what the plan and schedule for the day is. So one of the things, kind of getting back to this tantrum survival guide, right? We know that one of the triggers for many kids for tantrums is when there is an abrupt transition. So when they're not prepared for what's about to come, when there is a moment where you take away a tangible item like the Xbox, right, and they haven't been prepped for it, that can often be something that triggers one of these outbursts or tantrums. So do think about, rather than just grabbing, right, the Xbox, which I don't think you're doing, but grabbing the Xbox and jumping into, now we need to do this other thing. Just think about previewing that ahead of time, maybe using a visual timer to let your child know, or a visual schedule, that today the plan is you're going to have Xbox time during this window, and then we're going to be going on the family walk, and then you'll have some more time if you want to call a friend, and then it will be time to get ready for dinner, right? So just trying to map those things out so that they're not sudden. And don't create some of this behavioral backlash that sometimes we experience. Awesome questions. Keep them coming. So another piece, when we go back to this tantrum survival guide, just a second tip, we've got label and validate the feeling. Second tip is really thinking about ignoring or actively ignoring some of the mild misbehaviors that might come up. So mild does not mean that the behavior feels mild to you. It just means that it is not dangerous or destructive. So I know it's kind of like a high bar, but when we say mild misbehavior, that is actually what we mean. We mean that you should be trying your best to actively ignore or turn your attention away. That really means like turning your full body, turning your eye contact away from any behavior that your child is engaging with that seems to be designed to get actually your attention. So things like whining, complaining, crying serves many functions, but if you think your child is engaging in what we call crocodile tears, which are like tears that are created in order to get your feedback or attention, if you think that that's part of what your child is exhibiting in a precursor to some of these big tantrum behaviors, that's where you really want to turn on your active ignoring skills. Key to active ignoring is it really is an active process. It is not meant to be something that means you've totally disengaged from your child. It doesn't mean that you've engaged from from like the process of parenting. It actually is a part of parenting that is kind of essential. You're watching and waiting for a behavior that you can actually give your attention back to. So throughout this whole process, your body might be turned and your face might be turned, but you're still checking back to see if your child is calming down or beginning to exhibit any behaviors that you can praise and catch. So it really is this active process that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. The beginning is the moment that you notice the behaviors are starting, right? You are turning off your attention, you're shifting your attention away from your child in that moment. The middle is important to talk about because it's often when we actually see what's called an extinction burst, which is when behaviors begin to actually escalate as your child is testing out to see if they cry louder, if they whine louder, will you now turn around and pay attention to me? So that's the middle, and it's really important that you outlast that, right? It's really important not to tune in that moment because you will actually reinforce that behavior continuing. And then the end is that you're really hoping to be able to outlast that behavior and wait for your child to get calm. Or even if they're not fully calm, maybe they're still whining and crying, but they've actually started to do the thing that you wanted them to do to begin with. So like they're whining and crying while cleaning up the toys that they were supposed to clean up. That's great. You can still ignore the whining and crying and actually tune in and respond and praise and give feedback to the behavior that's positive, which is at this point cleaning up the toys, right? You're starting to see movement and progress with that. So that is tip number 2 in a nutshell, which is active ignoring, right? This is a huge skill that we teach lots of parents who are dealing with very significant disruptive behaviors. It is not the entire set of strategies, but it's one that can be really effective as long as you're also catching the positive behaviors that are happening, like I said. All right, so we also got a question recently that I thought tied in very nicely to this, which was, am I supposed to ignore hitting and throwing, right? So my child has started hitting and throwing, and I've heard all this stuff about active ignoring. This person was clearly reading some lovely articles on our website, so thank you. But do I ignore hitting and throwing? No, absolutely not. And I love this question because it goes back to that definition of mild misbehavior, right? We are actively ignoring mild misbehavior. That's behavior that, like I said before, is not dangerous, is not destructive. Hitting and throwing, we consider to be different than that. We consider those to be dangerous and destructive. So if those behaviors are happening for your child right now, if those are new behaviors that you're seeing, particularly with the current stress and anxiety that maybe is going on for your child or the disruption in routines that's happening, we do want to continue to set and maintain limits. And that really does go for those bigger behaviors that you see. Depending on the age of your child, that might look like something like a timeout procedure. So timeout is really something that we think about using most with our kids in more of that 2 to 7 age range. It can be used for older kids as well. It just maybe looks a little bit different, but thinking about using a timeout or using a loss of privilege. So if there's hitting that's happening or throwing that's happening, you're either using timeout, which timeout is really timeout from positive attention. It just means it's a break from you really and the positive attention that you're typically giving your child, or you're using a loss of privilege as a consequence. Those privileges could be things like screen time privileges, but they could be many other things that are happening throughout your day that your child does enjoy that are short and in duration. We're not talking about needing to lose a privilege for a week at a time. These really can be short duration, pre-planned losses of privilege that are used as consequences. So you might even be thinking about just loss of screen time for the afternoon, right? It doesn't need to be as big as sometimes we think those consequences need to be. You can also rely here on something that's called natural consequences. So we've talked about timeout, loss of privilege as consequences. Those are things that are pre-planned for any big behavior that aren't necessarily directly linked to the behavior that you saw, right? Like losing screen time honestly has not much to do with hitting. They're not very directly connected. It's just a pre-planned consequence that we have on deck. Natural consequences are consequences that really are cause and effect directly connected to the behavior that you saw. So if your child is in the middle of a tantrum and they break a toy, right, or they throw a preferred object and it shatters, it breaks, and it's something that belongs to them, the natural consequence is really just that we're not replacing it. So if your child broke their favorite Lego in the middle of a tantrum, you're not going online, right, like hopping on Amazon and going ahead and replacing that right away. That's a natural consequence. It's a really powerful and good way to teach your child that cause and effect relationship between behaviors that they might have exhibited and the results that can happen. So you can also always be using those as well to address things like destruction of property in particular. It's a little harder for hitting, but it's good for destruction. All right, just checking to see if we've got any other questions. And in the meantime, I will go on to, so that's our 3 tips for your tantrum survival guide so far. We've got label and validate the feeling so far, actively ignore mild misbehavior, continue to set limits around major misbehaviors, so dangerous and destructive behaviors like hitting or throwing. Tip number 4 is really just that all of this should be paired with warmth and nurturance and positive attention. So we know that there are many functions of behavior. One of the functions of behavior is that it can be, behavior can be serving the function of getting attention, right? So getting your feedback, which is so valuable, especially for young kids. They are really looking for that feedback from a parent. And what we know, as odd as it may sound, is that kids prefer negative attention to no attention at all. So, sounds strange, but they would much rather you be yelling and screaming at them because you're engaging and you're interacting than not responding. It's why active ignoring works. It's why we like that as a strategy, is because it really battles back against that function, makes it not serve its purpose anymore, the behavior. But we also know that a heavy, heavy dose of positive attention can really also help to prevent some of these behaviors from escalating. So if you are throughout the day labeling and finding opportunities to notice where your child is doing really well, that can help us to both reinforce that good behavior and see it continue throughout the day, and also just set up your child to be more ready to receive if there are commands throughout the day or directions that they need to follow. Kind of like fills up the bucket and makes them more ready to participate in the things that might be more challenging. So that is a key part too. Again, I'm going to go over our steps for those of you who are tuning in throughout. So we've got number 1, label and validate the feeling. We've got 2, actively ignore any mild misbehavior. 3, set limits and boundaries around major misbehavior like hitting and throwing. And 4, pair this all with warmth, positive attention, nurturance, right? All of that goes into play as well. All right, number 5. We're ready. Think about prevention and antecedent management. Antecedent management is a very fancy term that essentially just means think about things that are happening first and see if you can find patterns. So in a Facebook Live that we did earlier last week, I talked a lot about the ABCs of behavior, but I'm going to go over those again because honestly, they're so important when we think about how we manage challenging behavior. So really, that's like behavior management basics right there is the ABCs. So the A is that antecedent. It stands for antecedent and anything that's happening first. The B stands for behavior. That is what you're looking at when you're talking about the challenging behavior. So in this case, we're talking about tantrums, right? So the behavior would be whatever your child's tantrums look like. Tantrums look like a lot of different things. As we said, there's like the mild misbehaviors, there's the major misbehaviors. Your child's tantrums could involve just yelling and screaming or a lot of whining and crying, or they can involve these bigger behaviors like throwing, falling on the floor, more destruction, things like that. So that's the B. We really want to get specific about what behaviors we're actually talking about. And then the C is the consequence, or like I explained previously, consequence has this connotation of what I was talking about earlier, which is like a loss of privilege or a timeout. It doesn't actually mean that in the ABCs. It really means anything that's happening after. So you might not be using a timeout or a loss of privilege even yet, and we would still be gathering data on what's happening after your child engages in this behavior. It might be that they got the iPad back, right? That would actually be the consequence, which for them would be a very positive consequence, most likely. And that still counts as that category, that consequence category. So what we really want to think about with these ABCs is using this data, taking note of what's happening first, what the behavior looks like, what's happening after, and noticing if there are any patterns, right? So are there any things that are consistently triggering these major meltdowns or tantrums for your child? That is really, really helpful information that can help us to survive the tantrums because we can prevent them. So that's something that we really like to look at when we're thinking about changing the cycle or the pattern of misbehavior that you're seeing. we got a really great question that I thought many of you might be dealing with right now, which was a question around trying to balance working from home and your child's need for attention right now, and how that actually may be a trigger for tantrums that many people are experiencing right now. So I'll read you guys the specific question we got. My kid freaks out when I'm trying to work, like a full-on tantrum every time I open my computer. It makes me feel guilty for not being able to pay her more attention, but I'm also so behind and feeling really stressed out. Why is she doing this? What can I do to help her and help myself? And I really loved this question. As I said, I think this is something many people are experiencing right now as you are trying to balance the responsibilities of working from home with the responsibilities of being both probably a full-time parent and also a potentially teacher. So I think this is probably happening for lots of people and is likely that or antecedent to a lot of misbehavior, meaning that you've perfectly, whoever you are, have perfectly labeled that you are taking out your computer and you're starting to work and you're turning away your attention from your child, and that's when the tantrums are happening. That information alone tells us a lot about what we can do preventatively, because it's telling us that the function of your child's tantrums is most likely to get your attention and feedback. So what we don't want to have happen is actually for you to have to stop working, right? To stop pulling out your computer. That's not the goal. It's just for us to figure out how we can get your child to see other pathways to get what they're looking for, which is your attention and feedback, through actually positive behavior rather than the tantruming. So some options to work with this particular behavior, if it's something that folks are struggling with, is thinking about, like they said, antecedent management, fancy term for what we can do to prevent the behavior from happening. A couple things that work well is setting clear expectations for your child ahead of time. So instead of just grabbing the computer and starting to work without preparing them, think about setting up, like we talked about earlier, setting up a visual schedule or a visual timer, something to let them know when they can expect for that work for you to start, what they're supposed to be doing while you're working. So you might want to work with your child to figure out a couple of options of preferred activities that they would like to do while you're doing the work, so that that can go on the visual schedule. So maybe we have some special playtime with mom to start out with, then we're going to do some schoolwork, and then mom has to work. And so these are the two options that you have. You can do this yoga video and engage with that, or you can do some coloring, or we have an art activity that you can work on while mom is on the computer. So making sure to actually make those really clear ahead of time for your child, and also to work with them to figure out what they'd be excited to do by themselves. Also set the stage for what they can expect to have happen if they're able to stay calm while you are on the computer, right? So if your child is able to let you do the work, they're able to stay calm throughout that whole process, and they do engage with the yoga video or the art activity, what positive consequences are going to be on the other side, right? What good thing is going to happen? Likely here, we actually want to feed into the fact that they are looking for your attention and make the consequence something that is still giving them that. So maybe it's that if they make it through that whole time, they get to do a special activity with you. They get 15 extra minutes before they go to bed that's just with you. So really wanting to reward the time that they were able to stay calm and let you do your work with something that's really positive for them. And that still serves the same function, right? So function being to get that feedback, that one-on-one attention. All right, so I am going to, again, review those steps. Also, for those of you who are just tuning in, just a reminder that I am Meg Glick. I'm a social worker at the Child Mind Institute. I'm here answering your questions on these Facebook Lives, as well as my colleagues who will be on at 10 a.m. and 4:30 p.m. Mondays through Fridays. So we've been going over a tantrum survival guide, and I wanted to just review these 5 tips that I've given folks throughout this Facebook Live today. For those of you who are just joining, we've got number 1, which is label and validate the feeling that your child is trying to express. 2, actively ignore mild misbehavior. So that's things like whining, crying, complaining. Set limits, boundaries on major misbehaviors. So things like hitting or destruction of property. Destruction of property always sounds so extreme. It could just be like they broke a toy. It's not that big of a deal. But those are the behaviors that we're talking about. Number 4, pair all of this with warmth, nurturance, positive attention. That also means thinking about spending some positive one-on-one time with your child throughout the day as a preventive strategy. Even just 5 minutes we know can be really helpful to keep some of these behaviors at bay, keep them from happening. And then number 5 is think about prevention and antecedent management. Think about noticing the patterns of when the behaviors are happening and putting in place strategies ahead of time to prevent those triggers from coming up for your child, prevent the tantrums from starting in the first place. Also really important for us just to touch on the fact that, like I said at the very beginning, tantrums are normal. They're a normal part of childhood. We also expect they're probably escalating right now because of the current conditions that we're living in. We anticipate that kids have disruptions in their routine. They may be picking up on a lot of the anxiety that's in the environment around them. And we know that both of these are things that can create more problem behavior, right? They can escalate some of these tantrums that are happening. That said, we expect that over a couple of weeks, as people start to get into routines, as it starts to become a bit more of a new normal for us, we would hope to see that those tantrums start to dissipate, that some of these more significant misbehaviors do start to calm down. So things that I want you to be looking out for, right? If you're listening to this and you're saying like, oh my gosh, my child's tantrums are still happening very frequently, what we look for when we think that maybe there's something more to it, right? We think there's more help that maybe is needed, is the frequency, the severity, and the duration of those tantrums. Some more fancy words that I will explain. Frequency just means how often are they happening? So how frequently are you experiencing these tantrums throughout the day? Severity means what do the behaviors look like we talked about before. So are we talking about whining and crying and complaining, some of those more mild misbehaviors? Are we talking about a pretty high rate of more destructive behaviors, things that are creating unsafe conditions for your child or your family? And are these, when I said frequency too, we're looking at, is this something that's happening every few days, once a week? Is this something that's happening repeatedly all day long? That's a bit different. And then in terms of duration, are we talking about something that lasts for 5 minutes or so? Or are we talking about a tantrum that goes on for hours? So that's just to paint a picture for you guys of what we mean by more mild tantruming in terms of frequency, severity, and duration, and what we mean by more significant tantruming. And if your child is sort of persisting at this level of tantrums that you feel like is impairing, meaning that it's interfering with the ability for them to function, for them to get their schoolwork done, for them to get done what they need to get done throughout the day, hygiene-wise, sort of get through mealtime as a family, it's interfering with your ability to function as a family system, that's a spot where we do encourage folks to be reaching out for further support, just to make sure that there's not an underlying mental health or learning disorder going on here. As I said before, we know tantrums are normal, they're expected, and also sometimes can be pointing to some of these underlying difficulties. So that's what you should be looking out for to see if any further support is needed. That is your tantrum survival guide. So thank you guys for joining me. And just as a reminder, we are here at 10 a.m. and 4:30 p.m. answering questions live every day, Monday through Friday. You can post questions and folks will be checking those daily. And the Child Mind Institute is here to help with your mental health and parenting needs during this coronavirus crisis, no matter where you are. We have resources to help, from daily tips to consultations to gold standard telehealth services. Go to childmind.org/coronavirus. Be safe, and thank you for joining us.